So for the purpose of this video today, we're going to be discussing the philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion proper takes its place as a subcategory under the heading of metaphysics. You'll recall that metaphysics asks us questions about the state of being, whether the world is one or many in nature. It asks us about the questions of existence. How is it that the human body or the human is made up? Is it just body or mind or both? Is there a soul? This kind of thing. But one of the main questions under the heading of metaphysics is whether or not God exists. And if so, what is God like? Is God one? Is God many? Is God male or female? Or does that category even apply to God? And so forth. Is God eternal? Is God created? Is God is he derived from the world that we live in? Or is God necessary? Is he basic? Is he the grounding of all being? Well, these are questions that the philosophy of religion asks, and we're going to be getting into them. We're going to be looking at them. Now, obviously, for an introductory level class, we're not going to have the time to get into all of the questions, even really to mention all of the questions that could fit under this heading. So we will limit ourselves more or less to Western philosophy of religion, perhaps delving a little bit into the Eastern, just by way of mention, so that we can kind of compare and contrast. And that's what I want to do here at the first, just by looking at some definitions that are associated often with the philosophy of religion. So we're going to take a look at a few concepts so that we can familiarize ourselves with the language. All right, so the first one is monotheism. Monotheism is the belief in one God. And this isn't the belief in one God over and against many other gods. This is the idea that there is one God. This God is a creator God, usually. This God is the one who is alone in existence. Now, there may be other spiritual beings, but this is the only one that can be properly called God. That is a monotheism. Mono, obviously, meaning one. Theism is a term that we get from the Greek language. The Greek word for God is theos. And so whenever you see that in a word, it's usually theism or theist, or that term or that phrase, that root there is usually referring to God. So monotheism is the belief in the existence of one God. In contrary to that, there is pantheism. And pantheism is the idea that all is God. Now, whereas monotheism usually is the kind of worldview that took over in the West with the great monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam. In the East, pantheism has always reigned, and there's a fundamental difference here. See, in the Western traditions, God is understood as being separate from His creation, even if He is immanent in it. So God is something different than the created world, the material world. In the East, on the other hand, pantheism is the idea that all together is God. Everything, whether it be spiritual or material, physical or mental, all together is God. And it's kind of foreign to our Western thought to think in this way, or to try to conceptualize the world in this way. But pantheism is the notion that everything is God. And so this would necessarily mean that everything is one. All is one. And that is the foundation of the Eastern religions of Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, sort of an offshoot or an attempt to meld the two is a religion, or is an approach known as panentheism. Now, pantheism, without the N in the middle, pantheism comes from Greek terms theos. You hear the theism in there. That means God. Pan means all. So all is God. Pantheism. Panentheism sneaks another little word in there. It's a Greek term as well. Panentheism means all is in God. So all is in God. And so panentheism is different from both monotheism and theism, or monotheism and pantheism, in the sense that whereas monotheism sees God and the created order as separate things, pantheism sees them as the same thing. Panentheism is sort of a synthesis of those two, if you bring them together. And it says that, yes, God and creation are separate. However, it's almost as if God is in creation, or that creation is in God. Probably a good way to think about it is the idea that God is pregnant with creation. And so God is having an effect on creation, but creation, the created material world, is also having an effect on God. And so whereas monotheism sees God as sovereign over creation, and pantheism sees God as inherently in creation, panentheism tries to wed those two together and put creation inside of God, so that God is having an impact on creation, creation having an impact on God. Let's see, henotheism is the next one. The follower of a henotheistic worldview worships one God. However, they do believe in the existence of many gods. And so this is the idea that there's an entire pantheon of gods out there. And we may know about all of them, we may not know about all of them. However, we and our people in our city or our little group is going to worship this one God as our focus deity, if you will. We agree that these others exist, but this is the one God that we want to worship. We give honor to those, but we worship this one. And so that's henotheism. Again, that comes from a Greek word. Another Greek word, a different Greek word that means one, hen. So henotheism, one God, and it's one God that we worship, even though we admit to the existence of others, or the possible existence of others. So that's henotheism. The next one that we'll look at is polytheism. Polytheism, or the next one we'll define. Polytheism is the idea that there are many gods, and this is it comes from the word poly, meaning many, theos, meaning God. Polytheism is the worship of many gods. Now, this is kind of like the ancient Greeks would do. They believed in many different gods, and if you went into a major metropolitan city center in ancient Greece, there were likely temples and altars built to all of these different gods. They believed that Zeus is the god over thunder, and he's the sort of the head god. You've got Athena, who's the goddess of wisdom. You've got Hephaestus, the god of the underworld, and so on and so on. So you have many different gods, many different possible approaches to God. That's polytheism. And next we have atheism. Atheism is the notion that there is no God. It's the positive assertion of God's non-existence. It comes from the root and the prefix, the root being theos. The prefix is theos, or theos is atheist, and that an atheist is one who believes that there is no God. Now, somewhat similar, but yet different from an atheist is what is known as an agnostic. Agnostic comes from, again, two Greek terms. The Greek term gnosis and the prefix which negates agnosis. Gnosis means knowledge. And so the agnostic is basically saying that we are without knowledge. An agnostic means that we cannot know, or we do not currently have evidence or proof of the existence of God. Now, there are two different versions of agnosticism. There's one that is sort of a hard agnosticism, and another that is sort of a soft agnosticism. The hard agnostic says that we cannot have enough evidence. In other words, no matter what evidence you have of God, it still doesn't prove that God exists. No matter what argument you think you might have, no matter what body of evidence you think you might have, it doesn't prove, and it cannot prove, the existence of God, because it can always be explained in other terms. So that's the hard agnostic. He says that it's not possible. You cannot know. Now, the soft agnosticism is the one that says, well, the jury is still out. We don't currently have proof or evidence of the existence of God, but it's entirely possible, given enough time, given enough investigation, formulation of arguments, looking at the evidence and all that, that we might eventually be able to reach a conclusion one way or the other that God does or God does not exist. But currently, we don't have that information. And so the soft agnostic sort of leaves the question open. The jury is still out. We're still investigating. We still have to see if God exists or not. So that's the soft agnostic. Soft agnostic. So those are various terms when we're talking about God or talking about the philosophy of religion that might be relevant to our discussion. Now, another distinction that should be made is the answer to the question of whether or not evidence should play a role in one's religious faith. So in other words, one might say, well, I have this evidence, I have this argument for God, and that's why I believe. Another might say, well, evidence is not necessary in order to believe in God. You don't need evidence. In fact, some might say that evidence actually works against your ability to know God. It works against your religious faith. So so this breaks us up into two camps. There's the evidentialists, and those are the people who believe that the question of God can be settled by simply examining the evidence. And the evidentialist says, well, if any objective, non-interested observer, if any observer of the facts were just to simply look at the body of facts that we have about whether or not God exists, then the objective observer is going to be able to conclude one way or the other. Either God does exist or God doesn't exist, and they can do that on the basis of objectively reasoning with the evidence or reasoning through the evidence. Now, the non-evidentialist, on the other hand, is a person who believes that belief in God or non-belief in God is basic. In other words, we make that statement or that investment either in the belief of God or the belief in the non-existence of God. We make that statement or that investment of faith before we even start looking at the evidence. We've already drawn the conclusion in our mind, and so when we go gathering the evidence, we are likely to interpret the evidence that we do find in light of what we already believe. That's the non-evidentialist. So they believe that examining the evidence doesn't settle anything, because people don't go to the evidence with an objective mind. They don't go to it with a disinterested mind. They go to it either to prove that God does exist, or they go to it trying to read the evidence to prove that God doesn't exist. Either way, a person approaches the question with a prejudice in their mind and in their heart. They already believe one way or the other. They're just trying to find evidence for their particular belief. So that's the non-evidentialist. And the non-evidentialist would say, look, we don't need to settle this discussion or this question based on evidence. We just need to make an investment of faith one way or the other, and then live our life consistently with that. Okay, so there are the evidentialists, there are the non-evidentialists, and we're going to take a look. The first branch that we'll take a look at are the evidentialists. Now, the medieval period was dominated by thinkers who were preoccupied with trying to prove God's existence, trying to shore up evidences for the existence of God. One such thinker was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was a Roman Catholic monk who during the period of the Crusade, who lived during the Crusades, who was very much against going out and killing Muslims because he thought that was a terrible tragedy. I mean, Aquinas believed, as he did, that for anyone who was not part of the church, that they were going to suffer eternal torment in hellfire. And as a result of that, he asked himself, why are we killing Muslims if we don't believe that they're ready for heaven? Or if we don't believe that they're ready for the afterlife, shouldn't we rather go and try to convert them? And I mean, you have to admit that's a far more humanitarian approach that many others took in those days. But anyway, in order to do this, Aquinas used philosophy. He combined Aristotelian philosophy with biblical theology or Roman Catholic theology, and sort of fused the two in order to try to appeal to the unbeliever on the basis of what might be called natural revelation. Natural revelation is the idea that God has revealed himself in the natural world. And so Aquinas says, well, if I talk to a Muslim or somebody who doesn't believe like I do, we're going to each look at a different authority. I'm going to tell them that the Bible is the truth. They're going to tell me that the Quran is true. And we're not going to be able to get past that point. So instead of arguing the issue there, what we ought to do what we ought to do is discuss something that we both have in common. Well, what do we have in common? Well, we have this world in common. We have philosophy and reason in common. The Muslim and the Christian can both reason well. They both can look into the world around them and see the same things. And so on the basis, so Aquinas appealed to those who didn't believe like he did on the basis of reason and on the basis of the world that they have in common. And Aquinas formulates what has become known as the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The cosmological argument for the existence of God. Aquinas' argument basically goes like this. Now, he formulates it in 4 or 5 different ways, but we'll look at it from one perspective, and then we'll see sort of a nuance on it in a moment. But Aquinas' cosmological argument goes like this. It says the world contains contingent things. The world contains contingent things. Now, contingent things are things that owe their existence to something other than themselves. Contingent things are everything in the world that we see. For example, I'm contingent. My existence and my continued existence and your continued existence is contingent on a number of factors. Some of them we have direct control over, some of them we don't. For example, our lives are contingent on the earth maintaining a certain narrow range of temperature fluctuation. If it gets too far either too hot or too far too cold, our lives would be impossible here on planet Earth and we would not exist. My life is contingent on me having a meal in the last 60 days, right? I have to eat to continue to exist. I have to drink to continue to exist. I have to have oxygen to continue to exist. If you take any one of those things away from me for too long a period, I cease to exist. I will die. So my life is contingent on other things around me. I can't just live on my own. I can't exist on my own. And we could say that about a good number of things in this world, right? The chairs that you're sitting in are contingent. The internet that we're meeting on is contingent. The video that you're listening to right now is contingent. Everything is contingent on something else. So the world contains contingent things. Everything in the world is either caused or uncaused. Everything is either caused or uncaused. If we think about what is caused, we can find a whole lot of things. Those are the contingent things. Those are the things that are brought into being by other things, and they're maintained by the existence of other things. These are things that are caused. Now, the idea of an uncaused something, that's interesting. That is the thing that we don't directly experience, do we? Can you think of a single thing that does not owe its existence or does not owe its circumstance to something else, something that is uncaused? Certainly, it would be very difficult to do that, but we'll talk about uncaused in a minute. But Aquinas wants to make this absolutely clear in order to define his terms. So he says the world contains contingent things, and everything in existence is either caused or uncaused. Now, the next point is this. There cannot be an infinite regress of causes. There cannot be an infinite regress of causes. In other words, this thing caused this thing, which was caused by this thing, which was caused by this thing, which was caused by this thing. And if we go all the way back eternally, there cannot be an eternal and infinite number or regress of these causes. There has to be an uncaused causer at the beginning. There has to be a first cause. And when we talk about something that is that is a first cause, we have to realize that something is very different than us because we are contingent. We are caused. We call that first cause God. That's what we mean by God. God is the one that started it all off. And therefore God exists. So basically, if you think about, if you've ever seen one of those big domino things where people set up dominoes and they might even fill an entire room with dominoes in certain patterns, and then and of course when the last domino falls over, the reason is because the domino in front of it fell over and hit it. Well, what caused that domino, the one that caused the other one to fall? What caused it to fall? Well, it was another domino. Well, what caused that domino to fall? Oh, another domino, and so on and so on and so on. We could go back for thousands of dominoes, right? Each one of those dominoes, that when they fall, that's an effect that has been caused by something before it. So there's a whole lot of dominoes going all the way back to the very first domino, the very first caused event, and that event was caused by something other than a domino. Maybe somebody's finger poked it, and it knocked that domino over, or flicked it, and that domino fell over, and then that caused all the other dominoes to fall. But that very first domino was knocked over by something that was not a domino. Well, in a similar way, Aquinas is arguing that in this universe, all that we see and perceive are things that are contingent on other things. But if we trace it all the way back, there has to be a starting point. There has to be a beginning. And that beginning is something that is not in our material world. It has to be something outside of our material world, because everything in our material world can be described as an effect of something that has caused it. So this uncaused cause is not part of this material world. This uncaused cause has to exist outside of the world. That is God. Therefore, God exists. That's Aquinas' cosmological argument. Now, Aquinas' argument has been sort of modified down through the ages. One version of that is what is known as the Kalam cosmological argument. And the Kalam cosmological argument is similar, but it works on the idea of what might be called an actual infinite. It deals with infinite set theory, which is an established science, an established branch of mathematics. And infinite set theory is something that is just fascinating to examine, but the Kalam argument is based on that. And here's what the Kalam argument says. It says that you cannot get an actual infinite by continually adding finite things. Okay, so this is the premise, this premise has been challenged, but I will say this, given what we know of infinite set theory, it is a sound premise. You cannot get an actual infinite by continually adding finite things. I mean, think about it. If we start counting, and we keep counting, we will never actually get to the end of our counting by simply adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We could keep counting forever. We will never actually achieve an infinite just by adding one number. Even a trillion years from now, we're still counting. We still have not reached an actual infinite. So you cannot get an actual infinite by continually adding finite things. This world is composed of finite moments. There are actually finite segments to the world that we're living in. Why? Well, how do I know that? Well, if there were not finite segments to the time that we live in, then we couldn't travel from 12 o'clock a.m. to 12 o'clock or 12:01 a.m. Why not? Well, there would be an infinite amount of points between 12 and 12:01. So we could not get to an actual infinite between those 2 minutes by simply adding one more moment. So the world that we live in, the time that we experience, is composed of finite moments. Therefore, there had to have been a beginning of time. Now, why? Well, because we can't go back an infinite amount of moments. So there had to be a finite amount of moments. There has to be a beginning point in time. So why can't we go back an infinite number of moments? Because if we could go back an infinite number of moments, then we would never be where we are today, because we would have had to have progressed across an infinite number of moments. So there's not an infinite number of moments or minutes or hours or days or years going backwards. In other words, the universe is not eternal. It has to have begun somewhere. In order for us to get here, to be here now, there cannot be an infinite in the past. There has to be a beginning of time. Now that's kind of mind-boggling to think of. but it's true. The laws of logic demand it to be true. So the beginning of time must be caused by something that is not found within time itself. So the beginning of time must be caused by the infinite, that which is infinite. Only God is infinite, therefore God exists. That's the Kalam argument. Now, the book mentions also the argument from contingency, and this is a version of the cosmological argument that is birthed out of the notion of logical necessity. And it's based on what is known as the principle of sufficient reason. Now, the principle of sufficient reason is this. It basically says that everything that exists must have a reason that explains why it exists, and also why it has the properties that it does. For example, the reason for my personal existence is because my parents got together. They conceived me. I was born, and that is a reason for my existence. That is a sufficient reason, and it's also explains something of why I am and why I look the way that I look, because my genetics are a combination of both of my parents' genetics, and some has been taken from my father, some has been taken from my mother. All of those genetics have been sort of fused together, and that's the reason that I look and that I, in some cases, behave the way that I behave. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything has to have a reason to why it exists. And then it describes the difference between a contingent being and a necessary being. A contingent being and a necessary being. A contingent being is a being that owes its existence to something else. Again, we already talked about contingent things, but a contingent being is something whose non-existence is entirely possible. It is possible that I shouldn't exist. If I didn't exist, then we can very easily conceive of a world that exists without me in it. Contrasted to this, we have what is known as a necessary being. And a necessary being is someone or something whose non-existence is not possible. The principle of sufficient reason would say, I exist, but I exist as a contingent being, whereas God exists, and God exists as a necessary being. Now, why is God's existence necessary? Because we could not conceive of a world without God. Well, why not? Well, because the world is the way that it is because God exists. That's the argument from contingency. Okay, so all of those, the Aquinas' cosmological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, and then also the argument from contingency, all of those are based on the notion of causation. And it's basically the idea that everything around us is caused, whether it's time and the finitude of time, whether it is the existence of beings and the nature of their existence and so forth. Everything owes its existence to something else. And if we're going to have a universe where that's the case, there has to have been something that started it all off. That first thing that started everything off is God. Well, the next argument that we'll look at is what is known as the teleological argument. The teleological argument, and this is the argument from design. Telos is a Greek term that means purpose. That's where we get the term teleological argument. And in some ways, this is a simpler or more easily understood argument. The argument from design. The argument from design encapsulates a couple of different theories. Number one, you may have heard of intelligent design theory. Intelligent design theory was something that was started as a modern movement, was started about 25 years ago or so. And it's this notion that the world has sort of marks of design on it, and those marks of design are evidence of God, who is a designer. We'll look more at that in a moment. And then another argument from design, or another facet of the argument design, is what is known as the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle. Now, the anthropic principle is the idea that in order for us to be talking about design, there has to be something that exists, right? The anthropic principle would say that the world is geared in such a way that it supports human life. And I think that whether you are a theist or whether you're an atheist or an agnostic, whatever you are, when you come to the world, it does look particularly designed to support human life. Now, the anthropic principle is the notion that we can look into the world, we see these things that are highly tuned, that if they were off just by a fraction, that human life would be non-existent. For example, if the Earth were just a few thousand miles wider in its orbit around the sun, it would be absolutely too cold for human life or for any life to exist on planet Earth. However, if it were just a few thousand or maybe a million miles or closer to the sun, it would be far too hot for human life or any life to exist. So there's this narrow range of temperature that has to be maintained in order for life to exist. The orbit of the Earth is more circular, less elliptical. It is elliptical, but it's less elliptical than many other planets, that will oftentimes come much closer to the sun than further away. Well, that provides for a relatively even temperature on planet Earth. The gearing of the electromagnetic force on the Earth, the small or the greater or lesser, stronger, weaker nuclear forces, all these things, if they were just out just a little bit, why does a proton and an electron have an equal but opposite charge? Their mass is not equal, so why do they have an equal but opposite charge? If they weren't exactly equal but opposite, then the Earth would either, matter would not even be possible, let alone human life or life. And so the world that we live in seems to be particularly geared for supporting human life. How do we explain that? Well, the theist would explain that on the basis of, well, God created the world, so He created it to be inhabited by humans. Therefore, it shouldn't be surprising to us that it's particularly geared because it was designed by an intelligent creator. Those who are non-theists would say, for us to be sitting here and talking about the way that the world is, presupposes the world is that way. Therefore, really, there's no reason for it. It just happened. So anyway, those are two different approaches on the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle just says, look, the world seems to be geared in such a way that human life exists, and that it should and that it will exist. William Paley developed what is known as the watchmaker argument, and this is an attempt to illustrate the argument from design. The argument from design says that as we look inside the world, as we look across the world, we look into the universe, we see evidences of God's creative power. William Paley says it's like this. He says, if we saw a watch, if we were walking along, in the woods or in a field, and we're just hiking, we're enjoying nature, we're seeing all the beautiful wonders around us, but we look down, and a shiny object catches our eyes. We look down and we see a pocket watch laying there on the ground, and it's laying right next to this rock. If we look down there, we would not suppose in our mind that's sort of a natural thing. But if we see the pocket watch there, we do not automatically, by seeing that pocket watch, suppose that, there was some iron ore that was laying on top of the ground, and then there was some copper laying next to it, and as the lightning came down and flashed, it struck the ground right there at that particular moment, and it created this brass pocket watch. Furthermore, there was some sand there, so when the lightning hit that, it fused it into glass. It made the little intricate machine gears and springs inside with the hands and the numbers and all this sort of thing. We don't think that. If we would see the pocket watch, we wouldn't think that for a second. We would look at that and we would say, oh, look there, there's a pocket watch. Somebody must have dropped it. Because we assume in our understanding of the world that pocket watch is designed. It bears the marks of complexity. It bears the marks of specific purpose. So we would believe that pocket watch had a purpose. It was created. It was designed. It was manufactured by somebody. Why? Because it has evidence of the marks of design on it. Okay, well, that's fantastic. So we have this designed pocket watch and this not designed rock. the two are just simply laying there, and we, by reasoning, by looking at them, can tell that one is designed, the other is not. So if we apply this principle that we see with the pocket watch and the rock, if we apply that to the universe around us, then we can readily tell that the universe is a created thing because it bears the marks of design. It has to have a designer. It has to have a creator. It doesn't look or appear as if it's just sort of thrown together haphazardly. There are the marks of design everywhere, and you might ask, well, like what? What example is there? Well, at this point, the person who believes in the teleological argument will offer all kinds of evidence. So they will go into things like the DNA molecule, for example, and they'll say, well, the DNA molecule, which is basically present in every single cell of our body, the DNA molecule is a molecule that tells our body how to build itself. And it has so much information within that single molecule. It has so much information that it could fill a set of encyclopedias 4 times over. Which is something like, which is over 100 volumes of books. It could fill the encyclopedia 4 times over. That's 400, or that's 100 full-size volumes of text. That's how much information that every single one of these DNA molecules contains. And it's not as if you can just kind of mix and match like alphabet soup, right? You just look down in your soup and there's all kinds of letters scrambled. They have to be in order. Just like when we're reading through books, the words have to form sentences, have to form paragraphs, have to form chapters, and so forth. When we're reading books, there has to be a specified order within those books if we're going to be able to understand them, and then the words must make sense, and there must be content to the information. The same is true with the DNA molecule. So here's the thing. This goes beyond just the creation or the existence of a medium by which to give the information, right? The molecule itself is the medium. It's the textbook. But it's also the information that is programmed into that medium. So how do you get information? How do you get the transference of information, or the creation of that information from nothing, from that which is not information? So at this point, the one who believes in the teleological argument would conclude that, well, the universe bears marks of design, therefore it must have a creator. The DNA molecule has information. And we're not talking at this point just the fact that it exists, but it has information. And you've never seen information come from something that is not intelligent. Now, David Hume comes along, and David Hume is not a theist. He's an atheist, very outspoken one, actually. And David Hume engages this teleological argument. It was very much a big argument in his day. It was something that people were using. And David Hume challenges the teleological argument on several grounds. Hume challenges it on the basis, number one, that if you're going to make analogies between two things, those things that you're analogizing, have to be similar. And so is the universe similar to a watch and a rock? Well, no, they're not really that similar. I mean, the watch and the rock are direct objects of our observation, whereas the universe is not a direct object of our observation. We only experience a very small part of it. And quite honestly, it's the part that is in question, right? This part seems to be geared toward life. Well, as time has gone on since Hume, we have looked and we have not found life anywhere else in the universe. Not objective proof or even evidence of life. We look around and we see planets out there that we conjecture might have life because of their placement around their stars and so forth, but we have no idea actually whether there's life or not. So Hume would challenge this on the basis of those analogies aren't really quite that similar. We're talking about the universe versus a rock and a pocket watch. The second objection that he levels is that the parts of a thing cannot really always explain the whole of a thing. And so we have a very limited access to a very small part of the world, of the universe in which we're created. And based on what we see of this part, yeah, okay, we can conclude that it does appear as if it's designed, but that doesn't necessarily explain the whole. He would also challenge that nothing in nature around us hints at infinity. Therefore, to talk about the existence of something that is infinite, then what do we have that would explain infinite, except for our concept, except for our ability to conceptualize an infinite? We don't have actually access to an infinite, and if we did, we wouldn't be able to experience it anyway, because we're finite. We wouldn't be able to see, for example, for an infinite number of miles. We would not be able to walk for an infinite number of miles. We would not be able to live for an infinite number of years, and so forth. So we have nothing that we see in nature that hints at an infinite. Even space itself hints at a bounded sort of area. Now in Hume's day, to be fair, they didn't really have a good study of outer space. But even now, most scientists would say that the universe is a bounded, non-infinite thing. Of course, you'll get argument on that as well. And then the last point that Hume brings up is that nature points, if it does point to a God, it points to a God that is finite or blundering. Why is that? Well, I mean, there's a lot of really weird things that happen. For example, there are every spring flowers put off pollen, and that pollen goes, and very little of that pollen, that reproductive potential actually goes into making seeds, and so there are tons of pollen wasted every year. Would a God who is an intelligent designer, would he intentionally design something that is so wasteful, inefficient, and that sort of thing? This last objection is what is known as the problem of evil, and we'll get to that a little bit later on in our next session together. Some questions about design that would be good for us to consider. Question number one, does the idea that the universe has been created by God give a stronger basis for science than naturalism? Does the idea that that the universe has been created by God give a stronger basis for science than naturalism? To give you a few points to think about here, there are those who claim who first of all witness and they observe, and then they will point to the fact that modern science that we have, the technology that we've been able to develop, was developed in a culture and from a worldview that believes that the world around us has a specific design, and so many of the things that we invent are modifications actually on designs that we find in nature. You can think about Velcro, for example. Velcro was invented, and the guy that invented it as he looked at a feather. And if you tear apart one feather, and if you look close enough, you'll see that little feather, that piece of the feather has little hooks on it, that when you put it up next to the feather, those hooks grab a hold of it. Well, that's kind of what Velcro is. And so Velcro was developed based on that. And there have been many examples of that. But modern science and technology developed in a culture whose worldview was informed by a belief that God created the world in a very specific way, and that if we just look into the world closely enough, we will be able to understand and mimic the sort of designs and patterns that we see in the world, and we can then copy it to our advantage and develop technology based on that. Whereas those universes, or those worldviews rather, that did not believe in a God who had created the universe to operate in a rational sort of way, those, whether they be religions like Spiritism, who attributed the workings of nature to some sort of inherent spirit, or whether it was the atheists who believe that the universe just works by its own impersonal laws. Neither of those really give a strong basis for regularity in the universe. Because the spiritist would look and basically say that the events in nature are controlled by God, who is fickle and arbitrary, and so we have to appease God in order for God not to be mad at us. Whereas the atheist would look into the universe and say that the universe is governed by chance, that we are here not because of any grand purpose or scheme. You and I are here simply because the universe spit us up, and we are what resulted. And so the universe is it was all by chance. If things had been geared a little bit differently, we wouldn't exist, but we wouldn't be here to know that we don't exist. And so it's just all by chance, by accident. But if you believe that the universe is governed by chance or by accident, then why would you go into it looking for those designs? Why would you go into it looking and expecting that the future will be like the past? We've already seen that was one of David Hume's problems. So why would we even try to do science? Another question from design about the teleological argument is this: does the idea that the universe has been created by God give a stronger basis for ethics and morality, for meaning, for purpose, for worth, for dignity, and so forth, than atheism? And here's the notion. We'll come back to this, particularly before the end of the semester. But the idea here is that if people are just the product of random chance, then their hopes and their dreams are just the product of random chance. Their reason is just the product of random chance. Their dignity is just the product of random chance. There's no inherent meaning to anything in the universe because it was all just the roll of a dice. Now, you and I might have a vested interest in our own existence. The atheist would not deny that at all. But understand that whatever worth we attribute to that is really no worth at all, because it's just subjective. Like, if you hold your life to be valuable, that's how you value your life, and that's well and good. But if someone comes along who doesn't believe that your life has value, then who's to say that they're wrong? And so if beauty is just in the eye of the beholder, if value is just in the eye of the one who assumes it, then there's no such thing as true value, true purpose, true meaning. And if there's no such thing as true value, true purpose, and true meaning, then how can we say that anything is bad? How can we say that the bubonic plague was a bad thing that happened in the various places and ages in which it happened? We can't really say that. All that we can say is that it happened. Is that good or bad? Well, the people didn't like it, but that doesn't mean that it was bad. That doesn't mean that it was evil or malevolent or anything like that. So in order for us to say that something is objectively good or objectively bad, doesn't there have to be a God who has declared it? And that is, that's the question. We'll look more into that when we get to ethics, and again when we get to meaning under axiology. Anyway, so another question is: if the universe is created and therefore is designed, how would we recognize the design? How would we recognize the design? And the idea here is that if the universe is created in then basically everything that we see around us is created, whether it's a pocket watch or whether it's a rock. And if the pocket watch is created and the rock is created, then how are we to tell the difference between that which is created and not created? Because we've never been able to experience that which is not created. Now, in order to be able to contrast that which is designed versus that which is not designed, we have to be able to find something that has not been designed. Now, the pocket watch and rock that William Paley brings up might be able to show us things that have been designed by humans versus things that have been designed by God only. Then okay, maybe we could tell that the pocket watch was created by humans. But if the universe is truly created, then that means the rock is designed too. And the marks of design, of divine design, are not so readily recognizable, because everything that we see bears the marks of divine design. And so that would be a difficulty associated with this particular argument. we would have to have, in order to tell that this world is designed, we would have to have something not designed to contrast it with. And if this world, this universe has been designed, we don't have that which has not been designed. All right, well, those are the cosmological and teleological arguments. And with that, we're going to take a break in this video. And on the next one, we will get to other arguments as well. The ontological argument, as well as some non-evidentialist arguments for the existence of God. We'll see those in the next video.